All right, everybody. We are going to be talking about retention boosters for our next session, adult learning methods for effective training.
I'm Carrie Peters, the CEO of NewView Strategies, and I'd like to talk with you about retention boosters, adult learning methods for effective training. At NewView Strategies, we believe that adult learning techniques are essential for effective training of adult corporate learners. It is estimated that adults lose 70% of what they've learned only 30 days after they've had training. It's impossible to completely solve that issue, but today I'm going to share 10 methods that you can use immediately to help you hold on to the information that you've learned for a longer time. We already know that the retention of information is challenging, but what about attention span? We all know that attention spans are shrinking faster and faster, especially with the increasing pace that information is coming at us in digital media. Engaging learners in active learning activities help with both retention and attention span. Actively connecting to real-world examples that our learners experience every day is essential for this to be successful. This means that the material covered has to reflect reality. A textbook or an online guide just isn't going to do it. Incorporating slightly different ways to do something the same way, accommodating for interruptions in flow or the passage of time, and having learners repeat back how what they've learned will or will not work in their particular situation will help them to mentally apply the concepts prior to leaving the classroom. Applying concepts in a test environment is also a great way for students to try on a new concept they've learned before using it on their own work. Training must incorporate repetition as a technique to aid in adult learner retention. Here are a few examples of how we use repetition in our training. Certainly in lecture, we'll find more than one way to say the same thing. We may repeat 2 or 3 times, once at the beginning, middle, and the end of the learning session. Hands-on exercises during class are one of the key ways that we use repetition in our training. For all of our students, we provide them with their own copy of a Business Central environment. This is their playground, something that only they are using, so nobody else is going to mess up what they're trying, and they're free to explore by applying the hands-on exercises that we suggest that goes along with all of the training material, or they can try things on their own. Just being able to apply those things that they've heard in class immediately to situations that they're familiar with and business processes that they understand helps them to retain the information that they've learned about new concepts and things that they're exploring as far as how to use the software in a deeper way. In addition to things like learning environments, quizzes are also a great way to re-trigger the recall of topics. One of the tools that we use with almost all of our classes is a simple online quiz tool called Kahoot. It's spelled K-A-H-O-O-T, and we learned about this tool from a 3rd grade Sunday school teacher. It works great for corporate adult learners. Not only to having these kind of quizzes add accountability to the training, it also introduces the spirit of play and competition to learning, which also helps our learners to remember. Being able to have a little bit of fun during training is sometimes a new experience for people who have done corporate training in the past. And I will tell you that competition is a great thing to include in training, that when people know that there are some stakes, even if it's a simple gold star or a medal or a little trophy, that competition really spurs people to pay attention because they know their performance is being measured, even if it's in a small or kind of silly way. It really helps. We have plenty of our students who have had training maybe a couple of years ago, and when we come back to visit their offices, they still have those trophies out from that training that they took, and I guarantee you, because of that experience, they remember more of the material that was taught than techniques that don't use these kinds of games and competition to help. Having additional reference materials that we can revisit later also helps a whole lot. Whether it's just a class handout or it's an on-demand e-learning course that can back up that learning, having somewhere else to go to look up information later can be a big help. One of our most popular classes is on personalizing your software desktop. I often tell a particular story that illustrates a concept. And I'll tell you what that story is. One of the things that I would often do when I arrived on site at a customer's company is to walk around and observe how people were doing their jobs. I would get around to asking questions later, but for the beginning portion of my visit, I would just like to see and listen and hear and watch what people are doing and how their jobs are being done. And one very common thing that I discovered is when I would walk into departments where there was a lot of transactional processing, that I would hear a particular sound in that department. And the sound was of people repeatedly striking the tab key. So they'd do some data entry and then they'd stop and they'd hit tab 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and do some more typing and then maybe hit the tab 1, 2, 3. You might wonder what in the world these people were doing. As you listen to this story, if you were watching the students in my room, you would see some of them are starting to smile, and some of them are even making the same repetitive motion that I'm making with my hands of hitting the tab key repeatedly, and there are even a few groans of complaint. The thing that this story illustrates is that when people do not have their screen optimized for data entry so that they can move from one field to the next field in success, to get to the next field and then filling in some more and then hitting tab a whole bunch of times again. I've even told some of my students, and this is absolutely true, that one of my customers, the tab key was actually worn off. There was no label on the key anymore because they used it so often. And telling this story makes everybody realize the unconscious thing that they're doing. It motivates them to adopt a new practice that can replace this. Something very can go from one field to the next and the next in the order they need them without needing to fill all that space or take their hands off the keyboard to use the mouse. This particular story and the empathy, the emotions that it raises, even prepares these students to show others the same solution when they see it and they get back to their offices. So not only do these kind of stories elicit responses that really cause people to be engaged because they understand that you get what their work is about. This is not something that you're going to find on an online guide or a textbook. This is the type of story that we incorporate with all of our training that helps people to really understand that we know what is involved in doing their jobs down to the keystrokes that they make. And this is something that is incorporated in all of our training with telling stories like this again and again at different levels to help people to understand why the thing that they're doing might not work and what they can do to replace it and how they can even show other people how to use those techniques based off of what they got in training. Keep in mind that for the most part, corporate learners are distracted learners. They can only take on so much new information before they hit overload. And in addition, they've only got so much time to spend in training before their primary tasks begin to create pressure and mental distraction from the learning. Remember the days when we used to fly people to attend training for a few weeks or even a month to learn something? They may have even attended 8-hour full day sessions during that time. I know I did a lot of training like that. And learning in small periods of time spread out over more time, smaller goals, simply works better. Do you ever notice that when you see learning objectives at the beginning of a session, that there are only a handful of them? This is an example of setting realistic goals for that learning session. I'll bet that if you attended some of those long full day training sessions, that you did not retain as much information from those sessions as your team members may today who attend shorter duration sessions. One of the other things that we do with training sessions is allow for appropriate breaks. A 5-minute break in a long training session is not enough for an adult learner. So adult learners need to take care of their bodies. They need to have a drink of water, maybe have a snack. They need to stretch because they've been sitting the whole time focusing in on this training. They need to move their eyes away from the screen. But they also need to do things like touch base with one of their coworkers really quickly about something in between that maybe they've received 3 or 4 emails about since they've been in the session. And while we all would love for people not to check their email and things during training, it's very difficult to do. But if we set reasonable expectations on time management, where we allow appropriate breaks that allow people to take care of their bodies, as well as to take care of a minimal amount of tasks to stay in touch with their primary work, people are going to be far more likely to engage in training and not dismiss it because their primary work is more important to them than the training that they're receiving. So having things like appropriate breaks makes a big difference, and it also breaks up that training into smaller and more manageable chunks. Sometimes it feels silly to think of the idea of rewarding yourself for a goal like training, but I'll tell you that I love the idea of rewarding my learners, even with just a few words, telling them that was a great session. Thank you so much for your engagement. Go get a quick drink and stretch a little. We'll come back to the next session. You are all doing a great job in this class. Incorporating that kind of positive reinforcement makes a real difference, where those folks who are attending that training know that you care about them and you know that you care about their ability to learn and they like the encouragement. It's good to know that when they're engaged, it's making a difference in the learning effort that they're making. We do need to simplify what we are expecting learners to learn. We can't teach everyone every possible thing about a subject. We need to focus in on the essentials and equip learners to think through and find answers independently. I remember this was about 15 years or so that I attended some training, and it was 8 hours a day for a full week. And when I walked into that room for the beginning of that training, there was a 2-foot high stack of Microsoft manuals that were waiting for me there. And my immediate thought was, oh my gosh, how am I going to read through all of that information in 2 weeks and attend a class and take care of my job? I immediately was in cognitive overload, thinking of the task that was in front of me. I was in this class exposed to a lot of information and I passed an important exam at the end, but honestly, I retained very little information. Most trainers have a good grasp on how much learners can absorb, so be sure to seek input on the overall content that you're expecting people to learn. Will it be too much? Yes is often the answer, and an experienced trainer can help you figure out what the right balance is so that our learners are retaining as much as possible and not being stressed out or feeling overwhelmed during the process of training. What in the world is chunking? Chunking is a funny word, but it's really a process of organizing information into smaller chunks. This makes it easier for your brain to process and ultimately to remember the information. Any process that we cover in training should have some primary milestones to the process that will allow the learner to visualize the process as a whole. And even if there are many small steps in between each milestone, the major milestones of the process help the learner to create a mental map of the information and ultimately remember the overall process better, even if they don't remember all of the minute steps. They can always go to their reference material, their training instructions or manuals so that they can remember those small steps, but they'll remember the main process if they think about it in milestones or chunks. When we're talking about chunks or milestones of a process, focusing on one chunk at a time is really critical for effective learning. It's a great time to use active learning techniques to keep your learners engaged. Hands-on exercises where we do all of the steps and the outcome can be observed as correct or incorrect is a great way to help learners stay focused and to retain more information. Deliberate practice involves focusing on specific skills that need improvement, setting specific goals for improvement, and getting feedback from others. This is going to help you to improve your skills faster and retain the information better. A good example of this would be a peer-to-peer exercise that allows small groups to debate whether a process will or will not work. Having the learners collaborate on proving the method and maybe even improving the method engages their brains in a different way. And they'll remember the experience of the exercise, which will trigger what they've learned at a later time. We have to remember that everybody learns in different ways. Some people need to watch a video or a lecture, some people need to read material, and some need to do active research. Some may even need to learn by doing the actual task itself. Incorporating many of these different techniques in the same training will make retention of the material more successful for people who have different learning styles. And it's an important thing for us to remember as we're putting together a training program. I feel like nobody ever talks about accountability after training, so I wanted to be able to include that in this session. Why do we pay so much money and take so much time for training and then not engage techniques to help our teams to retain the information? Accountability to new process adoption is a big thing. How many times have you heard about an implementation that had failed adoption? And how many times have you seen a new process trained and then weeks or months later, you found out that people reverted to what they were doing before? Unfortunately, it's way too often. Accountability to the new processes is really about making sure someone else is checking and making sure the process is still working in the real world, and to make sure that our team members who are doing the new process, that if they have objections and questions, they're addressed. These are all things that we need to be doing to help with accountability to a new process or new learning. Refresher training is a different way of doing this. Refresher training is a review of concepts learned that were previously repeated at a later time. It's a great way to deal with this. It deals with the gap of losing 70% of what we learn within 30 days. Having that refresher training brings that information back up and allows us to hang on to more of that information longer. Because why? Because we've repeated it and we've reinforced it. By the time we engage in refresher training, learners have come up with more questions that they didn't think of previously. And it's a great time to reinforce the training and the new techniques and to make sure that they are still working. And if they're not, to address the reasons why and help the folks who've had that training correct their course. We'd love to hear your feedback about this session. If you can take just a moment, scan the QR.
All right, we're going to move on to Q&A. We'll deal with the survey in a little bit. If anybody has questions about retention, we'd love to have your questions in the chat. So we'll take just a couple of minutes to talk about those particular techniques.
Yeah, so go ahead, put your questions in chat. Carrie, I just have a couple of follow-up comments and questions to your session. I think one of the things you mentioned in here is that we do ask that, the students or trainees are dedicating the time that they're in class to making sure that they're paying attention and dealing with, their phones and everything else in those designated break times. I think we also found as instructors, it was just as important for us that if we promise that you're going to have this time, that we stay on schedule so that they know, we're told we're getting this 10-minute break at 10 a.m. I'm going to get it at 10 a.m. I think we also found that we needed to stay accountable to make sure that we were delivering on, that schedule that they were given as well.
Yeah, that's actually huge because especially if you're training consultants, a lot of them are scheduling meetings during that time or phone calls. or promising that they're going to get back to somebody with an answer. So when we have our training sessions, we're super strict about that. We have an on-time start and an on-time end, and those breaks happen at a time that the students can anticipate. And if we have training from day to day, they know that it's going to be a certain time every single day, so they can plan ahead. And it's really been a game changer with how people pay attention, that people aren't just sitting buried in their email, they're constantly checking or leaving the room, because they know that they can depend on that and handle the parts of their business that just need a little bit of attending and still focus on the training. And that was a really important lesson that we learned early on in the first years of our company when we only did training, that having that structure was important, but having the accountability to the trainers, that is not negotiable, because it really helps people with focus and eventually with retention.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially with the Consultants Accelerator, we found, they're working consultants. They may have a meeting right at the end. So if we keep them 2 minutes longer, now, they're running from meeting to meeting without even having a chance to catch their breath.
Yep.
So Jack mentioned in chat that he believes chunking, such a strange word, offers
It is.
continued rewards and accomplishments throughout a learning topic. Do you have any additional comments or thoughts on that?
I think that's a great comment. I think that just being able to break things down helps with understanding, but then rebuilding those pieces together into the whole is where the learning happens. That we can look at so many disassociated pieces as part of learning, even in different learning sessions, but until we combine them on maybe a timeline or as part of a process, that it doesn't really make sense. And especially with some of our newer consultants, we have a lot of people entering the industry who aren't necessarily savvy to business process. And I actually think it's harder for people to learn business process than it is for them to learn how to use the software. We all learn how to use all kinds of new software all the time. I think about how many apps you have on your phone, and you don't attend a training session to figure out how to use an app, right? Now, I will say Business Central is just a little bit more complex than that. But being able to understand business process and how that works along with the software is a complex thing. And it's a big thing that we're asking of people who haven't been exposed to that with real world experience yet.
Yeah, I think something really cool that we saw, especially with the Consultants Accelerator as well, is, and Michael mentioned this in his video, but a lot of what we were talking about, we have our stories of here's what we've seen in the past. I had this customer and this happened. But then they're going out and they're experiencing the same thing. So it's like they come back with these stories, and it's cool for us to hear what they're experiencing. So it's almost kind of like a trade-off of, oh, this just happened with this customer, and it's a really cool experience to be able to share those stories.
Yeah. And I think that most of our students, especially our customers, have the question of, well, what are other people doing? And that's one of the benefits that we can provide as consultants, is we've seen lots and lots of different companies in many different industries, and we have all these all this knowledge about what works and what doesn't work, right? What to avoid.
Right.
So learning those stories and learning those situations is part of the training process, right? Not only does it make it more interesting to listen to, how you process an accounts payable check, but everybody enjoys a good horror story, right? The drama of something that went wrong helps us to remember something. And it's just a human trait. So being able to use that kind of storytelling and relate that helps people to remember as well.
And I have plenty of accounts payable horror stories in case anyone needs to hear any. All right.
Yep.
So I don't see any more questions in chat, but I just have one follow-up question. So with the kind of adult learning techniques that we've talked about, how do you see that being different between maybe an in-person environment and a virtual environment? And then also as a tool, I'm wondering if you can also speak to fidget toys as an in-person training technique.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of those topics that I'm perennially conflicted about, because I go back and forth between, in-person training is the thing that you have to do, and virtual training is the thing that you have to do, and in-person doesn't work anymore. I go back and forth. And what I have learned in my own internal conflict about this is that we need both. It really depends on the situation and it depends on the learner. And more importantly, it matters on timing. So when we had the session at the very beginning of the event here, Erica was talking about how learning in the moment was such an important thing. And we have definitely found out that scheduling training is probably one of the most challenging things because it's very difficult to anticipate when people need training and when they're going to be mentally open to that training, you know? So if we just say we're going to have, this class available in April and September, it may not fit the needs of those people who are needing that training, right? They may need it on their own time frame. So because of that reason, I find virtual training much more effective simply for the fact that the person who needs it can get it in the moment that they want it. And I think John, who is attending here today, he had provided a little bit of feedback that he really appreciated some of the on-demand classes that we provide through LearnDynamics.com because he can stop and rewind and he can listen to the concepts and he can go back and maybe think about it. And so that's a couple of things, just, getting the learning when you need it, being able to consume it in the amount that you can handle in the moment, and then being able to go back and review it makes on-demand stuff really valuable. But I'll also put the caveat on that it totally depends on your learning style as well. Some people are really turned off by the idea of watching recordings and doing things and not having an instructor to ask questions of. So that's why you have to have all of the different learning modalities available because you have those different learners with different needs. And think about implementations too. You guys have all been involved in implementations. What's the correct answer to what is the exact right timing for the training for this implementation, right? Ask 10 consultants and you're going to get 10 different answers. And for me, it always depends on what are the learning capabilities of your team, how distracted are they, and are we going to be able to stick to the time schedule or not, which is always a tough question. So I think I might have given you more questions than answers on that one, Carrie.
Yep, that's great. All right. Any other questions for Carrie? Okay.
All right. Well, let's keep moving then. I'm going to pause just a second for our survey. So take just a minute, everybody. And if you can scan that survey again and give us some feedback on that session, let us know the value of that for you and what you would like to see in future sessions. We review each and every one of these surveys, and this really helps us to put together our content for our next events. And we will continue having these events in the fall and the spring after each new release. We found that there's definitely a need out there with partners looking for information on how to apply the newest release information to their customers. And that's why we're providing this as a free event for our customers. And thank you guys for those who've been filling out those surveys as we go. That input is very much appreciated. All right, so next up, we're going to have just a 15-minute or so session on how you can engage NewView for custom training and services.